All right, good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on from where you're joining us. This is another API review, and today we hopefully only have a few items because, well, not much going on. We have most of our red items addressed, and that's pretty much a good thing because it means we are making forward progress towards zero. Maybe today we can get everything done but one. The utilization abstraction will be discussed in, I think, 2 weeks from now. People on vacation. So I would suggest we just jump right in. Adam, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes, I do. Imo, can you click on the link to the proposal? Yes, so as most of you most probably know, we have a thing called file mode.append, which allows to open a file stream for appending to a file. But with the current implementation, when the file is being opened, we seek to the current end of file. And from then, the next writes are basically happening on this particular offset, and we increment it after every successful write. The problem is that it doesn't work when you have multiple producers that write to the same file. And in the example that I have provided over here, we have two threads that are basically trying to append data to the same file. This is a common scenario for loggers, for example, where we have multiple modules and they are all logging something to a single text file. And the solution is to use native capabilities exposed by every OS. The problem is that each OS allows us to append only to the end of file, whatever it is. So we don't seek, we don't monitor the offset. We just transfer this responsibility to the OS. However, the mismatch with the current implementation for file mode append is that the current implementation allows for seeking. So we open the file and we try to append at the end of the file. However, we also allow for seeking. So you can open the file, let's say it's 10 bytes, write 5 bytes, and then move the offset to byte number 12 and overwrite the content again. And I would like to make a proposal for introducing a new mode called append atomic, which does not allow for seeking, so changing the offset position, and always appends only to the end of file. That's it.
So presumably, when you create a stream with that flag, we would also return false from can seek.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody is silent. I assume that means most people are in agreement. I mean,
this seems like a good thing to do. I guess the one question I have is, why not just make append do the right thing instead of adding a new mode? I realize there's a compat issue there, but don't we have other compat issues that we have other ways of dealing with for file stream?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. And the answer is tricky. I would like to paste the link to the chat. So I had a conversation with Steven Top about this, and our current doc for file mode append says, open the file if it exists and seeks to the end of file or creates a new file. And this requires append permission. Trying to seek to a position before the end of file throws an IO exception. The point is that the current implementation only checks the end of file when the file is being opened. And once we add something, we don't update the end of file. And I believe that it's a bug. And my argument for that is that before .NET 6, we didn't have a single unit test that would assert the fact that we can open the file, add something, and then seek backward. However, for example, Stephen doesn't agree with my interpretation. And Jeremy Kuhn, the previous owner of System.io, said that it would be a breaking change, and it's better to introduce a new mode. So
I think in addition to that, atomic operations in general, even for the file system, can potentially be more expensive or have different performance characteristics to non-atomic operations. And I don't think we want to change an existing non-atomic operation to become an atomic operation by default. I think we need both for different scenarios and use cases.
But do we need both? I mean, it seems to me that once we add append atomic, then append is useless, and I should just open and seek to end a file if that's what I really want.
I mean, it depends on if you're wanting to do any kind of multi-threading or parallel access of the file.
I didn't understand what you meant by that.
There's no need to be atomic if you're not having concurrent access to the same file.
Right. So if I don't want to be atomic, then I can just use file mode open, seek to end a file, and do whatever writing I want.
Right.
Yes.
Or you could just append like people do today without potentially changing the performance characteristics or behaviors. Most of the file APIs today aren't atomic in any sense. And Jared has gone on huge blog posts and tirades about how, that's wrong, but that's also how the existing world is. And if we want to fix that, we should likely be introducing new APIs that are explicitly atomic and direct people towards using those for when they have scenarios that need it.
So that one I would agree with, because it's kind of the problem of the shape of the API, not so much the behavior of the APIs, right? It's a typical pattern of like file exists and then file open, right? That's kind of fundamentally busted. But I think, to the atomic argument, you could say if the user passes in a file share of whatever the equivalent of none is, I forgot what it is. Basically, when you don't have any sharing, we could just silently fall back to the old behavior. We don't pay the perf penalty, right? So I think you could argue that ignoring the breaking change, if you do a file share of like read or write, and you say append, we basically have an atomic append behavior. That doesn't seem, at least from a performance standpoint, that seems reasonable. You only pay for it when you actually care about concurrent access.
Well, I may be overly optimistic here, but I kind of wonder if the OSs don't already do that for you.
That might be true too, yeah. I mean, my question would be also, what does the C runtime do? Like, I have no idea what the equivalent in fopen is for this thing, but I mean, it seems reasonable if the default in C would be, you use an atomic append, then it can't be that bad as a default, right? But yeah,
yes,
I mean,
and to be honest with you, when I got introduced to System.io and I became the owner and I read a book about files basically, I was surprised with how our current implementation was written. And also I have found few questions on Stack Overflow. Why aren't we using the native capabilities exposed by OS? Here I mean the O_append flag on Unix and append data, file append data on Windows.
yeah, I mean, on the one hand side, like, so the breaking change argument, I get it, but my question really would be, how breaking do we think this actually is in practice? It's like, we had this discussion now on multiple features, and I really don't like the idea of us adding more and more API surface to give people more and more options when we believe those should be the default, right? Because it just means that, by default, the code people write that feels intuitive isn't good enough, right? So it seems intuitive if you do file mode.append, that looks reasonable, right? And it's like, well, that's the bad one. You should use file mode append atomic, right? That, I think if we do this over time, like, the APIs just become more and more complicated and more advanced. That doesn't need to be. So if we believe the breaking change is real, but it's, somewhat fringe, one option we can consider is, because this is for 7 anyways, we ship it in the early preview of 7, give people a switch to turn it off, and then we just see how many people actually complain. And if nobody complains, then I guess it's good enough, right?
My expectation isn't that this will be a breaking change in behavior. You could probably observe some difference in the output of the file due to what used to be concurrent writing no longer being concurrent. but I do expect that there will be potentially some performance differences, and that would be my concern.
Sure, we could measure that though. Like, I mean, that seems
Yeah.
also something we can just look at.
But I think the bigger concern is that the file APIs in general do not have a lot of atomic operations exposed today. And so if we were going to say, let's start making the breaking changes to make things like file.append be atomic by default, we should take a more holistic approach at the file system APIs and whether what it would take to make all of them be atomic by default, if that's the direction we want to go.
Well, I mean,
because
I think there's different
if
kinds of atomicity, right? This is just, I mean, this is, if you, I mean, we already had the mode like in the product forever where you can actually share the file, right? And so like, it's similar to like, what is this called? The named pipes, where you basically share the buffer for multiple processes and you have to coordinate how you write to that buffer, right? That's kind of similar to how file share access on the file works as well, right? You have to kind of agree on the protocol on how you can do that. But that's different from, making the file system APIs in general support an atomic mode, right? Which I don't even think Windows necessarily has.
it does. But my point is that, there's the general thing of we don't exactly have an API to we don't have all the APIs necessarily to allow users to perform multiple actions as a single operation where the underlying system allows it. One of those is atomically appending.
Right.
And so if we want to make the breaking change and not expose a new mode, I would ask that we first go and look at what are the other atomic operations we're missing. Where would we have to introduce new APIs because the current APIs don't make sense? And where could we make breaking changes? That way we could make a better decision of, do we want to expose new APIs everywhere because it's more consistent, or vice versa?
I mean, it's fair to take a larger look. I don't know. I'm also kind of not liking this taking smaller things or holding smaller things hostage for this larger thing that we may never do, because then it's very hard to make progress. Like, I mean, it does strike me as, given the API shape of FileStream, where we actually have file share already, it doesn't seem super unreasonable to say, like, there's this super small scenario of like, yeah, I have a common file that I share, and all the writers are just appending to that thing, so I want the append operation to be atomic, right? That's not like a super complicated concurrent scenario, right? And just unblocking that by introducing either that flag or by saying we change the default behavior doesn't seem necessarily a bad thing, even if we never do the larger thing, right? Now, if we do the larger thing, then sure, you could argue that it would be nicer to just say, the old thing isn't concurrent, the new thing is concurrent, but I also don't think it hurts if the old thing has some areas of concurrency that is, well defined. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessarily the right thing to just say, oh, we block this entire thing on this investigation.
Well, I think the thing is if we decide that there's enough APIs where we can't make the breaking change due to whatever reason, then we likely want to continue having a way to non-atomically append, even if that's just for perf scenarios.
So that's kind of my question.
Yeah,
so
but speaking of that, we haven't measured the perf yet, so we are not sure whether it will be worse or not.
But also, I think the perf one has an easy opt-out, right? We could just say because you have to specify the file share, right? So if you basically say I don't want to share, you just fall back to the old behavior transparently. Like you wouldn't have to give people an API for that.
And that's a fair point.
So I don't think that's why I said earlier, like, to me, the perf argument, sure, we should measure it, but I mean, if you say file share none, then the old behavior clearly is good enough, because nobody else can open the file anyway.
You might have file sharing and your own existing primitive locking mechanism that's different from the file system one, because you might, for example, be using a logger to write to a file, and the logger is only used from within your own process, and so therefore you have your own synchronization primitive that is much cheaper than necessarily whatever the OS is using, which is more likely a kernel level mutex to synchronize across multiple processes trying to do the operation.
But Tanner, I would be really surprised if anybody using .NET would implement such a thing, because you always need to specify the share flag. when opening a file. So you always need to think for a second.
Right, but
And
my point is that you might be sharing, but only within the context of a single process, in which case you're not in which case you don't want the atomic append, which would conceivably be a kernel level mutex, because you might have a cheaper mutex that you want to use at the process level, such as a simple spin lock, because you're doing many small writes, such as from a logging system. There's lots of considerations there for what type of lock is appropriate, and therefore whether you want something at the kernel level or the process level.
But if it's all in one process, can you be opening the file exclusively anyway?
Not if you want multiple streams open within the process.
And why would I want that and have a single mutex that I'm using to guard all of those?
Because it might be more convenient for state management.
Yeah, but I would also say I'm okay with saying, if this seems like a super narrow use case, and like making everybody's life more miserable for that use case doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing either, right? We could just say those people have to change their code. I mean, so this is why I said, like, to me, kind of depends a bit on the perf investigation too. Like, maybe that's a non-scenario. Maybe as Jeff already suggested, maybe the OS already does the right thing, or maybe it's just fast enough.
Yep.
So we could take a look. I think, to me, it would be interesting to understand a bit more what Steven's concerns were, because I don't think I fully understood what you were saying, what he said. But I feel like
I have pasted a link to the comment on GitHub.
I have to figure out how to get there from here. Hold on.
Okay,
Maybe.
so if you can get there from
Of
here,
course.
in this particular issue, there is a link to a PR, because originally I have sent a PR that was introducing the breaking change, and then the discussion started.
I see. Yeah, so to me, I mean, the fact that it is a breaking change, we should be, of course, deliberate about that. We shouldn't just, stuck them in and then just call it a day. But just because there is a breaking change doesn't necessarily mean to me that we must do an API for that. Because, I mean, we do have quirks, and we do have the ability to say, sorry, it's in a new major version. We believe the new behavior is good enough. So that's why, to me, it kind of depends on how breaking is it, how likely do we want people to have both options available to them. And that, so far, I would say, to me at least, it's not clear that we do know that for a fact. It seems like there's different opinions in the room on whether people want to explicitly choose one over the other. So I don't quite.
And if you in this particular comment, I have provided a link to the docs, and the docs are saying, like, the first sentence from my comment above. So to be honest with you, I believe that if we didn't look at the current implementation but just read the description in the doc, we would expect the appends to always happen at the end of file, and seeking to be impossible.
I mean, this one is an interesting one, right? I mean, that would definitely break code, right? If that's true.
I have responded to that. There is no need to change the required permission.
Okay.
Because on Windows, we are currently always using a flag called generic write, which also consists of append.
I see.
So it wouldn't be a new flag. It's already there. Actually, I've been doing that for a long time.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, to me, I mean, the takeaway here would be, we should look a bit closer at what we think the right behavior is. So that's basically the perf argument that Tanner brought up. Then there is the scenario, which, I have an opinion on, but it's largely uninformed, right? It's based on gut feel. Like, I mean, Tanner's example made sense to me as a high level that you want to just share within the process. But I'm also not necessarily convinced that that means we can't possibly change the behavior. Like, I mean, it would be okay for me to say, yeah, sorry, you're one of those 1%ers. You're unhappy about the perf, well, go use different APIs, or go use the other one, right? If we believe that this scenario is more common. And I think concurrent appends, I don't know, based on my own experience and how I use certain files, that does seem like a fairly plausible and straightforward use case of the APIs.
Yeah, actually, I have raised a question about that on Twitter, and some people were surprised that it doesn't work in atomic way as of today.
For what it's worth, other languages don't either because the C APIs don't.
Yeah, but in C, when you write on Unix, you just pass the O append flag, and that's everything you need. So
right, but that's the difference between what C provides by default, what C and C++ provide by default, and what the POSIX APIs provide by default. One is more like an operating system level API, in which case you're not using the standard library, you're directly key invoking effectively. And we could expose those, but that's then different behavior from what the default for a given programming language is.
Okay, so do you know how they implement the append?
The C APIs by default are all scalar primitive operations so that they can be fully cross-platform and supported on all platforms, because many platforms didn't get atomic operations for file systems until later. The POSIX and native operating system APIs expose additional parameters or options that you can then use directly to do atomic operations, like create and write, or open and append.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that we can agree that I'm going to write some benchmarks, measure the potential performance difference. If there is no regression, then we are going to reconsider introducing a breaking change. If there would be a regression, I will be back with this topic in a week from now. We are going to discuss it again. Is that okay?
So if there is a regression, it would be also interesting to know how file share options interact with that. Like, does the OS always do something expensive in the kernel anyway, or is basically that a kind of a, like, does the file share non-effectively disable all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to measure that as well. And one thing that is important when it comes to file share is that on Windows the log files are mandatory, but on Unix they are just advisory. So anyone can choose to ignore the log, basically. So even if we log the files, someone can still open it and write to the file. So, and with by using the native OS capabilities, we just don't care because we are appending to the end of file, and OS is supposed to take care of that.
The other thing that I'm not sure how we get clarity on is the scenarios. I mean, that to me is still a kind of orthogonal thing. It's like, do we believe that the API is fine, but I need something to make sure that we did some work today, quote unquote.
My view in general is that, especially when we're talking about these low level basic functionality to the framework APIs, that we are much better off exposing more operations and primitives and then exposing higher level things on top of that for the convenience use case, because otherwise we end up blocking out users from being able to do things. Like, this issue starts with, today it is impossible to do atomic appends, but it's not impossible to do non-atomic appends. And so in general, I think it's good for us to expose both capabilities and then let users pick and choose. And then if we have a use case of, well, it's not very convenient to use these APIs, we can build something on top of that. That way you have the ability for low-level framework authors to do the thing that they need, while also allowing app authors to do the convenient thing for them.
Is it possible though that like the current default use case, people actually wanting that behavior, is marginal enough that it should be made the non-default? Like, give the person the option if in the rare scenario where it really matters, but like don't punish all the new developers
Right.
who just make better behavior.
I think that's completely reasonable too. Like if we determine it's not a terrible breaking change to make atomic append be the default, I would still be in the position of, well, we should be exposing a way to non-atomically append as an alternative. That way framework authors who actually care about the nuance and the difference can do the right thing. It's the whole reason we expose the interlocked primitives in system threading, and the reason why we expand those with new types. It's the reason we expose the hardware intrinsics when we already had system numerics. One is convenient for app authors and one's convenient for framework authors because their use cases and performance needs are very, very different. And you can always build one on top of the other.
But still, can't you get that just by opening the file without append using file mode.open? The only difference between that and file mode append today, it sounds like, is that we do some stuff around trying to prevent you seeking. If all you care about is getting the performance of non-atomic append, I think you can do that today with file mode.open, right?
Yes.
I mean, what Tanner just said resonated with me, like as in, if we consider these file constructors here, I mean, maybe I'm unfair, but I'd actually be in the wrong thing here. Oh, I think oh, this is the right thing. Here we go. So, I don't consider this necessarily here as the average person's code, right? Because that's people very often do the file.open overloads or the convenience one like file read all text, file write all text, right? And then so it might be okay to say this is the power user API, right? The constructor that takes all the arguments, and you basically have to know what you're doing here. So this is the power user API that gives you more control. And so we could say the middle ground option is we just think about higher level APIs to make people's lives not more miserable, while also giving the the power user the switches that they need. That makes sense to me because I think that that's kind of the the role of the BCL is to allow effectively the more advanced stuff, while also making normal code decent, right? The only thing I don't like is if we say like, oh yeah, we messed up a default in V1 and now we're stuck with that behavior forever, right? While that's often true, there are cases where we can just make a breaking change and make people's life easier without asking everybody to call a new overload and passing in more and more parameters, right? And whether that's the case here or not, I think I don't have good intuition on this, but I think this middle ground might be also an option we should consider. All right. Anything
like
else?
in particular, file.append all lines, it doesn't even return a file stream. I think that one would be completely fine to, by default, be an atomic operation of sorts.
Right.
Yeah, and another thing that makes appending more complex when it comes to the atomicity is that in FileStream we have buffering enabled by default. So someone can try to write a very big string, and in theory we will just copy part of it to the buffer, flash it, and then try to write another part, which really doesn't help. And part of my proposal was also to disable the buffering for the atomic appends.
Yeah, I can see that. I've certainly, how do I say this without using the F word? I've certainly hurt myself badly by using memory streams and having issues with either dispose or not flushing streams in the middle. That is that is a thing. Although I will say what have confused me the most, I think, was, what is it, file mode write, where you open the file for write, but it doesn't truncate. So basically, when the new data is smaller than the file was, you basically have garbage at the end. And my code worked for a very long time because it just happened to be that I always wrote more than there was in the file initially. And then at some point it wasn't the case, and then my data was corrupted and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. So yeah, there's certainly ways you can misuse these APIs without being very obvious. But I think that if you do concurrent access, I mean, some of these things would materialize relatively quickly. So you would think that normal testing would show that you have like buffers out of order and bad things happen.
Yes.
All right, so then I guess this is it for now, and then you will come back in a few weeks.
I will. Thank you very much.
Good. All right, Kevin is on. I think Kevin is even in the call, right?
I am, although neither Jeremy or Levi are.
And why is Levi not here? He texted me earlier.
I think he said he was going to miss it.
Oh, damn it. So that's unfortunate because, I mean, I don't think any of us are qualified to take a look at your crazy suggestion, but we can still entertain it depending on what it is.
No, I mean, in the interest of, not moving forward, and, I'm not an area owner. I'm just, a guy with a turkey sandwich in a basement. I think we can do this one for next time.
Oh, I think the only I think I remember now. This was the thing we discussed, right? It's really more like the yeah. I think I remember now. No, I think we can talk about this because it's more like the policy on obsolescence more than anything, right? So the problem is that the existing, so the ones you want to obsolete, they basically choose the number of the hash algorithm is basically baked into this thing, right? And we don't believe that security anymore. People should actually choose the other overload that makes them choose the hash algorithm. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of constructors on RFC 2898 derived bytes that accept the number of iterations and the hash algorithm. So this class was introduced in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
And for the constructors where we don't accept the hash algorithm or the number of iterations, we pick ones for you. And in 2005, the ones that we picked made sense. In 2021, they're not good anymore. We can't change the defaults because we need deterministic behavior, and even if we could figure out a way to change the defaults without breaking people, whatever we choose now would be bad again in another 16 years. The reason why I want to obsolete these is because if you are using the constructors that have the defaults, you may not be fully aware that you're using something that chose defaults that were suitable for 2005.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And presumably, when we would change the hash algorithm, it would change the output, right? It would change the bytes it would generate, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is something that where if you do want to change this, somebody has to version this correctly within their own application. It's not something that we can just change for them. The one thing that probably makes this a little bit difficult is the constructor that accepts the hash algorithm is actually very new. It was added in .NET Core 2.0 or .NET Framework 4.7.2.
Yep.
So the constructors that aren't taking the hash algorithm probably have very high usage. The suggestion to work around that, and I was to implement an analyzer that had a quick fixer that would move you to a constructor that made those defaults explicitly called out. So we wouldn't be able to change anything for you, but we could at least quick fix you to a constructor that did fill in the default values for you, so that when you look at that line of code, you go like, oh, wait a second, I'm using SHA-1, or
right.
I'm using 1,000 iterations. and the obsoletes should steer people, away from them that are starting, greenfield.
Right, and then presumably other analyses would kick in that says like, hey, you're explicitly using SHA-1, you probably shouldn't, which is another set of analyzers that I think we have, or at least we're planning on having. So that seems sensible. I mean, I think to me the availability doesn't really matter, because when we apply obsolete, we do it in some version, and that version has the other overload, so that's actionable, right? That's also, so that's not problematic in that sense, because it's not an analyzer that would flag an API, but then the API you're supposed to call doesn't exist yet in your version of .NET, right? So they would always be coupled. So if you get the obsolete message, the other constructor is there for you to call. So it's not a problem, right? So you would only get the warning on .NET 7, right? And then, well, in .NET 7 you have the other overload available for 3 versions now, so it should be good. Well, 5 versions I think even, right? Oh god, 6 versions. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah. I don't know why it doesn't show in .NET 5. Oh, because it's in a different thing. Never mind. Yeah, I can. Yeah, branding doesn't help. So, so in that sense, I think I'm okay with the obsoletions. The fixer is interesting because I think, as you said, like it's not like people probably want to make sure that that they at least can replicate what they currently have. So one thing we could consider also is, just calling it out in the actual message what the defaults are. And I think Jeremy suggested a message anyway, which I liked. Because then if we do the quick fixer, cool, and if we don't do the quick fixer, well, at least you have it in the error messages. And then you can, I don't know, if it's if it's 1,000 or if it's a hash algorithm.SHA-1, then I think that would be good to indicate.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think
mean,
I'm fine with that. Anybody else? Dissenting opinion? I mean, that's one of those areas where I think breaking changes are not appropriate, because if we change actual document data silently, that's pretty bad. And then let me just summarize that up. Okay, so then let me just do this. API needs work, so that, I think it's good, but I think it would be useful to, get Jeremy's and Levi's take on the final messages. But I think the one thing we should also do is assign a diagnostic ID so we can document it. And then people can also suppress it centrally if they really want to do it, because it's at least 4 overloads. Cool. Happy with that?
Thank you.
The next one.
Did you want to slap the approved label on that one, or?
Well, that's why I've added the needs work. So like, just change the message, because I really want Levi and Jeremy to like okay the final message, because that one I don't feel warm and fuzzy about myself to do that.
So So it's effectively provided Jeremy and Levi say good, then one of them can mark it API approved.
Yeah, we
correct?
don't need a meeting for that. That would be
Okay.
my expectation. I'll ping Levi later today. And I think this was, yeah, I think this is something that I already looked at offline. It's pretty straightforward. You know, it's just another thing to expose. We already have Arabic extended A, so it seems pretty straightforward to expose Arabic extended B. So I mean, unless somebody has an objection, I would just approve it. It seems like a no-brainer. Oops, no, I pressed the wrong button, of course.
It looks good to me, and that's the name of the Unicode character set. So
Yeah, that's why I said, like, there really isn't, if we want to do this, there really is only one way of doing it. This is a fine one to not. All right. Even on the call? Probably not. Can anybody else represent this? Otherwise, you can just give it a quick read and see whether we can make up our mind.
I'm supposed to be able to cover this, but I have not paid attention to this issue yet, so I cannot.
Are you the regex owner now?
Yes.
Oh, I see. So the idea is that we want to have a... basically want to have an upper bound on how long this thing executes? Is that the idea?
No, it's basically a new engine, a new regex engine underneath the covers that instead of being non-deterministic and doing backtracking, it's using a deterministic.
But that makes it
approach.
bounded, right? I guess that's why Steven calls it constrained, right? Because you basically don't have unbounded perf, right? Because the problem with backtracking is that you can have these cases where this thing will basically take 5 years to execute, right?
Right. And in this new mode, it won't do that. There won't be backtracking.
Is this the MSR engine that we worked with?
Yes, that's exactly what this is.
Gotcha.
This is.
Okay, then I think I have context. So then it just boils down to what you want to call this baby, right?
Right. That's kind of what we're coming here. Like he says, other name choices are DFA, deterministic, safe, predictable. I don't like the last two, I guess. I kind of don't like constrained either, because it feels like constrained is like a negative connotation.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, maybe that's just to me, but
to me, constrained kind of implies that the language you can use, like the actual regular expressions you can use, is limited, versus it really means the runtime is bounded, right?
well,
which is actually a good thing.
Well, it's true though.
it is true, right?
What you said at first is true.
Oh, I see.
There are certain things you can't do. There is certain things you can't do with DFA.
I see.
Engine.
Oh, because there is actually backtracking expressions, right? And they obviously have to backtrack.
Right. And the other thing is too is it'll change how your matches or your captures come out depending on the regex as well. Like we have this funky thing that basically only .NET regex engine does this thing where if you have loops, we have the capture multiple times.
I see.
Could we just call it DFA engine? I don't really like just deterministic or constrained either. Just like constrained, I agree it's kind of a negative connotation and doesn't really describe what it is. It stands for deterministic finite automata.
Right.
And deterministic is I don't think that fully describes the scenario, because the other regex engines are also deterministic in that given the inputs and the options, they will always return the same output. So it might be confusing to some people who think that it means like, oh, maybe there is some randomness to the output and I want it to be deterministic, but I think for the people who know what DFA is for regex, they'll instantly recognize it and everyone else will be able to read the summary and understand it there as well.
So today we only have an NFA effectively?
Correct.
Yeah, I'm fine with calling it either DFA or spelled out. I think if you do regex, you probably know what a DFA is, would be my guess. At least I knew what a DFA is well before I studied computer science. But maybe
I mean, I wonder if Steve wanted constrained. That's the one he actually put in the proposal. So I don't know. I'm assuming if we don't pick constrained, my assumption would be.
Yeah, I mean, given that he listed the other ones, I think he just wanted something in the API proposal. I don't think that it's probably his preference, but I don't think he's necessarily gung-ho about it. I mean, personally, I think they're all fine choices because they all kind of like, none of them are really like, oh my god, this is the name, right? They're all convolutions to a certain extent.
At least DFA is pretty specific about, for good or for bad, pretty specific about what it is.
Yeah. I think DFA is my preference because of that.
Can you compile DFA with compiled, or are these okay? So it's,
we might not be able to support it right away,
but in principle we could, yeah.
Because the idea is we're also wanting to do a source generator, and so maybe source generator plus DFA would be possible in 7, but not the IL emit plus DFA. Just for resources, basically. Like that would be a lot of work to do.
What if we said, what if we called it DFA constrained? That way it was clear that there's constraints on what it can do because it's DFA, but it also calls out it's specifically DFA constrained, so there's no ambiguity on what that means.
I think if you don't know what a DFA is, you kind of just have to like research it regardless.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's true regardless, right? Because basically, when you activate that mode, there's restrictions on what regexes you can use, and it has a particular set of, implications for your runtime, right? Which you need to research no matter what. So I think like whatever the documentation is for this parameter, for this enum flag, would explain what a DFA is in probably the very first sentence, right? So it seems, I think I'm kind of okay with that because it's a bit unfortunate that that's the mode that we want people to use, probably because it's the least problematic one. But I don't know what to do. Like, I mean,
that is the unfortunate thing here is like I would recommend anybody turn this flag on any regex they use, and only if it doesn't work and they have reasons to use the old behavior is to turn it off and go back to the old behavior.
In particular, my only concern with just DFA is that it's a 3-letter acronym and it's going to be capital D, lowercase f, lowercase a, because that's the naming convention for .NET. And so just DFA seems not friendly, but DFA engine or DFA some other word seems like it might help a little, but that might just be my own preference on naming things and weirdness on how it looks.
People like bounded.
I think constrained is better than bounded if that was the secondary word.
Yeah, what is it bounded by? Time?
Yeah, I mean, basically you don't have degenerative cases where you run
I mean, it's non-exponential asymptotic complexity, right? This kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah, algorithmic complexity is bounded.
Hey, Dan.
The thing I mentioned. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I jumped in because I realized Steven's out, so I thought I'd stick my head in. The thing I tried to mention in the chat is that it's not at all, and I think Eric was suggesting this, it's not at all necessarily a case where you have to, when you're picking for this anomaly, you're choosing between fast and safe. This may well be fast and safe. So something like constrained could date quite quickly, because it's like, we want everyone to use constrained. It's sort of like mini dumps are actually the biggest dumps. That word didn't age. And so I don't know how that might be something that makes constrained seem a little like you're compromising. But actually you may not be compromising, and so that's why I would be less inclined to that. And DFA is implying an algorithm that's probably a stronger implication than it should be, because they jump into like NFA in the middle if it looks like it needs to. So it's really DFA in kind of flavor rather than actuality. And so it would be nice if we could somehow hint at its behavior rather than its implementation. That was just my take.
It seems like you want to call this thing optimal. It's like, it's the one you want. Don't think about what it does. Yeah, it seems like deterministic.
Regex option should have been the default.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's kind of the I don't know what to do with that, because it seems like we want this, that everybody should have that as the option moving forward, which kind of makes me think the name needs to be that people people would see that and say like, oh, I probably should specify that, which means any sort of lingo like DFA or constrained, or that kind of implies people do research first, so that it's more like an advanced thing that most people wouldn't do. And yes, we could have an analyzer that tells people to do that, but it's probably super noisy, so people wouldn't do it. So it kind of, I think we need to have a good name that seems simple, like compiled, for example. Right? Compiled sounds positive, it sounds fast. People kind of get a sense of what it does. So kind of something like that.
You can already compile regexes. This does like change like which regexes are valid, right? So I think having something that people can look up that doesn't point just to MSDN is actually kind of nice. Like, I think having DFA in the name is kind of a feature. Like, either you know it and it's very informative, or you don't, and it kind of tells you what to look up and why it matters.
Yeah, it totally is true. I mean, it's just a question of like, do you think a person using this API, doing regex options seeing the name DFA, are they likely to OR it in or not? And that one I'm not sure, because we know that historically, the more obscure the name, the people will not start with those usually, right? And then, oh, the stuff works, and then just move on, right?
So we also, of course, have bad history of naming things after their implementation rather than their contract, like hash table, right? And we regretted that.
There's that too. That's why I said, like, to me, the name, I mean, constrained is not bad. It just has a bad connotation, but something that ends, a single word thing like compiled is certainly attractive. Predictable doesn't sound bad, because it doesn't make any sort of specific guarantees.
Similar to the conversation that we had on file system, have we considered taking a breaking change and making this the default and adding a new legacy option for you want the old behavior?
So
break all look behind.
Yeah.
So we have discussed quite a bit whether we could essentially channel existing calls into this engine where we know that the pattern is such that they will get the same or better results, and that is potentially a future direction to go for some future time. But right now we just don't have the confidence, both in detecting which patterns would work and also in that the engine is quite as stable and well characterized as the existing one. So it would be nice if we could find a way to make that happen in future. I'm not sure that options would be part of that solution.
But like, I mean, this is early for 7, right? So could we say we ship in 7 the default as the new engine, and then see who complains, and then use that as a, can we make this the default or not? Or do we think that most regexes will not work with the new engine?
Well, it doesn't matter if most regexes don't work if we route to the other one. The problem is, at that point, are they losing the bounded behavior they thought they were asking for?
No, I meant
the
like
other question.
Sorry. What I was, I think what Tanner was suggesting is similar. What I was suggesting here, which is you don't look at the actual regex and decide which engine to use. You just say, you're now on .NET 7, by default you get the new engine. The new engine may not handle everything, and if you want the other behavior, you have to OR in some use legacy engine flag or something.
We can talk about it, but unfortunately, backtracking is always going to break, right? So I don't have a good mental picture of how much that is. There's also lesser concern. There's some things like atomic assertions that aren't implemented yet, but there will always be a significant number of regexes that can't use a DFA engine.
Yeah, I think that's the question.
And the break on your captures and what captures you get back.
That's right.
Well, that's kind of but I think it's an interesting question, right? So if you could make it the default, would you say like, sorry, there's too many cases where it doesn't, so it always has to be an opt-in? I mean, if that's the case, then it's a bit like, then maybe the name doesn't matter so much, because it's always something people have to choose, kind of like how they choose artisanal bread at that point. It just becomes a preference thing for the scenario, in which case the name should be descriptive. But if we think the vast majority of people should really use the new engine, then it seems unfortunate if we have to have an option that people have to pass in rather than just making it the default. That's kind of
it's tricky. Another thing to throw into this is the existing regex APIs are rather rich and defeat some optimizations, such as doing everything entirely on spans.
Right.
And they're much richer than almost all the other engines. And so we've discussed potentially adding a new API. And at that point, of course, we could make it use the new engine entirely and nothing else.
Right. One thing that I just remembered about making it default is if you did regex options.compiled and we didn't support compiled with this new engine for the first release, like, what would you want to have happen there? Throw or do it not compiled, right?
No, I would say you throw. I mean, it's kind of what we do in other cases.
Well, then you would throw. We would throw
operation.
Every time somebody would say, unless we actually implemented regex options compiled, we would throw for everybody by default.
Oh, I see what you're
saying. When they said regex compiled.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's true.
Another reason, I just don't think we can make this the default.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's a good point. Yeah.
There's some interesting points made here, and I know that Stephen isn't here, and Margus, who's the kind of architect of this engine, isn't here. I wonder if it would make sense to ask them to listen to this discussion and then come back.
Yeah, we should send them the recording, which fortunately we have now. But like, I feel like, it seems like it's largely a discussion on two things. One, what do we name this puppy? And then the other one is, how do we make sure that people pick it, right? Because I still think, based on the conversation, we would like most people to pick this thing for the cases when they can, and only use the other engine when they actually need the other behaviors, right? Which
it would seem like picking the right option, if it's not the default, would be, and even if it was the default and we needed people to know when they had to pick the other, then an analyzer is the right approach for it. Cyrus added support to Roslyn a while back for correctly processing and syntax highlighting regexes, and I think these same APIs should be usable for doing basic analysis of, like, does this contain backtracking, and therefore does it require the NFA?
Right. The funny thing there is, of course, Tanner, if your regex is known at compilation time, probably the future does not currently exist source generator is always going to be better.
Mm-hmm.
So if the dynamic choice would be made on dynamic regexes, and an analyzer presumably couldn't help with that.
Yeah, and Cyrus's thing is fairly dumb. So as soon as you extract things in locals, for example, it sometimes doesn't colorize anymore because it would have to do flow analysis to figure out what is a regex and what isn't. So it's, unless you're willing to do flow analyses, the analyzer wouldn't be super cheap. I think that's the other thing where, analyzer would be nice, but I suspect even if we could write one, unless we can actually inspect the regex, it would be very noisy. So I'm not sure that we can. So I think no matter what, we should make sure that we have a name that we like.
It sounds like this one's tabled.
Yep.
Okay, thanks guys. Bye.
Mark, this is API needs work, so just it comes back to us. Alright, so then I think that's it for today. Unless I missed something. Nope, that's it. So then thanks everybody, and then I see you next week. Bye bye.
Bye.